so much fun to be here, and thank you so much to the hosts for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk about some things that are of interest to me. I was a little bit worried about whether I'd have enough time, but I had a triple espresso with Greg, so I think he may be done in 10 minutes. So I'd just like to talk a little bit today about understanding compulsions a little bit better. And I think that we may have underrated a lot of aspects of compulsions. So if we actually take a mental step backward and think about it, how much do we actually really know about our patients' compulsions? Do we actually know what the proximal and distal goals are of the compulsive act? I think we make a lot of assumptions as clinicians and as researchers, a lot of those assumptions being driven by the DSM, which tells us that there are two reasons to do a compulsion, and that is to ameliorate distress or to prevent harm. But I think if we actually talk to our patients, we might find that it's a little bit more interesting than that. How often do compulsions actually achieve their goals? We treat them as something that's bad and that's something that is that goes against the person's interests. But in fact, if we actually step back and look at it, compulsions achieve their goals a lot of the time. And what is happening mentally during compulsions? We paid a lot of attention to what happens mentally following an obsession, but I'm not sure that we've spent a lot of time looking at what's going on cognitively while people are performing their compulsions. And why should we care? Well, behavioral interventions are among our most powerful clinical tools. As Paul was talking about earlier, thanks to Jack Rackman and colleagues and their research on compulsions and the relationship between anxiety and anxiety reduction following a compulsion, we now have a very powerful tool for dealing with them. But one of the most common problems in OCD treatment is the successful implementation of our exposure-based methods. So fear of exposure is associated with treatment refusal and dropout. Some patients simply fail to benefit from doing exposure-based exercises. And I would argue it's not because the behavior can't extinguish or the anxiety can't extinguish. I would argue that probably we've misapplied, we're exposing them to the wrong thing because our case formulation is impoverished. So I really think that as clinicians, we really need to consider that if we're only helping 50% of the people with OCD when we take into account treatment refusal and dropouts, that we really need to think about what we're doing, and we need to think about where our lacunae lie. And I wonder if part of that lacunae is in our understanding of compulsions. So again, leading to impoverished case formulations, which means that we don't get people doing the right things at the right time in the right way, and in a way that's compelling for them. In terms of actual research on the phenomenology of compulsions, it's actually surprisingly little systematic research has been done. So of course, Rackman and Hodgson's 1980 book is one of the best books out there on obsessions and compulsions, and it was published in 1980. It's still a fantastic book, and I recommend it to I have all my students read it. But it was published in 1980. There hasn't been a whole lot since then. Salkovskis, of course, has done some really fantastic work on reassurance seeking, stop criteria, elevated evidence requirements. So started the dialogue, started asking these questions again. Radomski and Rackman have looked at the impact of repetition and doubt, repetition on increasing doubt and decreasing memory confidence. And they've also done some really interesting work on reassurance seeking as well. So all of those findings are, I think, helping us understand why compulsions are in fact so compelling for people. Elam and colleagues in Israel have been just sort of parsing compulsions and studying shared versus unique features of compulsions or behavioral actions in people with OCD and without OCD. And although the findings aren't surprising, that guess what, people with OCD do more actions and they take longer and do more repetitions. But what this has created is a bit of a way of understanding and approaching the study of compulsions that I think that we can bring to bear on research that connects those repetitions and unique acts to psychological factors, which in turn will help us be able to treat better. So I would like to just talk today about some of the research we're doing in our lab on the phenomenology of compulsions. So I'll start with a study that has already come out. It's a diary study, and this was with 22 people with the principal diagnosis of OCD. And they first completed measures of OCD severity, appraisal, inferential confusion, memory and sensory confidence. And then they kept a diary of compulsions 3 times a day for 3 days. So we asked them to please complete the diary each morning, afternoon, and evening in response to a compulsive episode over 3 days. So that led to 9 episodes. In the diary, they were asked to keep track of the obsession that yielded the compulsion and the amount of distress it caused, as well as parameters of the compulsion. So how long did the compulsion last? How many repetitions occurred within the course of that episode? And questions about if you repeated it, what impact did that have on your memory confidence, on your confidence that you'd done the compulsion properly, on your confidence that you had achieved your goal? We also asked them, why did you stop? What was it that made you stop the compulsion? How did you know it was okay to stop, or what made you stop? And this was all qualitative information that they wrote in. And then what we did with that qualitative information is that we looked at the episodes that people reported in which they said they stopped because they achieved a sense of certainty that it was okay to stop, or they achieved the quote, right feeling. And we then looked at the episodes where it was terminated for other reasons. So for example, that they were going to be late if they didn't move on, or somebody interrupted them. And what we found is that in our sample of 22 people, one person only ever terminated because they were certain, like 100% of the time, and one person never had certain episodes. Everybody else had some episodes where they terminated because they got the sense of certainty, and other episodes where they didn't get that sense of certainty. And so what we did was a series of within-subjects comparisons of the certain versus what I'm going to call uncertain episodes. But first, let's take a look at some of the notable findings here. First, compulsions worked for people 55% of the time. So apart from those 2 people where they either always worked or never worked, for everybody else, 55% of their episodes resulted in a sense of certain or terminated because they were able to achieve a sense of certainty. So that is an incredibly powerful intermittent reinforcement schedule, which is highly impervious to extinction. I think it's useful to understand just how often that quick fix works for people. If you could do something to reduce your distress or to meet your goal that's going to work more than half the time, why wouldn't you do it? Especially if it's only going to take a minute. Why wouldn't you do that rather than go through all the distress of not doing it? Distress over the obsession, interestingly, was not associated with beliefs about obsessions. So that was actually a really surprising kind of finding. And one would think, okay, there goes the cognitive model. But you'll see, don't worry, Paul, you'll see that the cognitive stuff comes back in a minute. What we did find is that stronger beliefs about responsibility and threat overestimation were in fact associated with fewer episodes in which the sense of certainty was achieved. So what this suggested to us is that once the compulsion was enacted, then ideas about responsibility and threat started to play a role in the person's judgment as to whether or not they had successfully averted harm or whatever their goal was. So we see that the obsessions maybe are playing an interesting role in the compulsion part of thing, even if we're not seeing it as activating the distress over the obsession, at least in this particular sample. I'll just show you now our comparisons of our certain and uncertain episodes here. So what's interesting is that if I'm shaking, it's because of the coffee. So we see that there's no difference between whether the sense of certainty was achieved or not. That wasn't predicted by events that happened before the compulsion. So it wasn't like if you had an enormous amount of distress over the obsession that it seemed to take longer or it was harder to resolve or achieve that sense. It seemed to be more what would happen during the compulsion. So we see, okay, first of all, the length of the compulsion wasn't significantly different whether or not they achieved certainty, but the number of repetitions was, I think I lost my dot. Okay, my dot's gone. Anyway, the number of repetitions was higher for the episodes that terminated, that did not terminate in certainty. And we certainly see that the ones that were terminated, or by reasons other than achieving certainty, were associated with greater sensory and cognitive doubt. There was increasing uncertainty across repetitions for those people, for those episodes, and there were elevated evidence requirements were stronger in the uncertain episodes. The relief was much higher in the certain episodes. So just some quick conclusions here. These data sort of supported the idea that elevated evidence requirements, doubt, and repetition were associated with a decline in memory confidence that were observed in compulsions that were conducted in vivo. Heretofore, a lot of that research had been done in the lab, so it was interesting to see it actually playing out in vivo. But there's no clarity as to why compulsions yielded certainty half the time despite at least some repetition. I think that's an interesting question. Negative beliefs about responsibility and harm were associated with the outcome of the compulsion. So maybe we do need to pay more attention to mentation during the compulsion. But this was a small sample and it relied on retrospective self-report. So they would come back to the diary anytime within 5 minutes to 5 hours after completing it. So we needed more research on this. The second question we wanted to address was what are people trying to accomplish when they do their compulsions? And again, we tend to assume that compulsions are enacted to reduce distress and or prevent harm or negative outcomes. But I wonder if is it more complex than that. So, for example, in Paul's original model in 1985, you say this, Paul, that probability of harm is less important to the person than being responsible for that harm. And that has certainly been a big course of research for our hosts who have done some fabulous work on deontological guilt, etc. And so this suggests that there may be some complex reasoning processes that are happening during compulsions that would be really useful to us as clinicians to be understanding better. But there's actually very little research on what people's goals actually are when they do the compulsion. And there could be considerable merit in understanding what the goals are and how the person themselves are framing them. So we just recently collected some data, some lab data, and this was a non-clinical sample, but they were selected on, we selected people who are high and low in contamination here, so people in the clinical range on the contamination scale of the DOCS, and people in the normal range. And they were required to contaminate their hands by touching a damp sponge that may have come in contact with germs, bacteria. And they were allowed then to wash their hands for 30 seconds. And after which they either assembled gift bags for preschoolers in our building. So we have a little preschool downstairs, so 2- and 3-year-olds. And so they had to assemble gift bags that would go to the preschoolers. And we called that the high responsibility condition. Or they sorted paper, low responsibility. In advance of contaminating their hands, they knew which group they had been. They knew which task they were going to have to do after the hand wash. So after they completed the hand wash, we asked them what their goal was. Just asked them to just verbatim, what was the goal of washing your hands just now? And we took down the verbatim responses. And what was interesting, so in the low responsibility condition, the answers were clean my hands, get rid of germs, dirt, bacteria, get my hands clean again. There were a number of responses suggesting restoring the hands to the state they were in before they had to touch the damp sponge. But what was really interesting is that in the high responsibility condition, what we found is that people were more than twice as likely to write, be absolutely sure my hands are clean. Get rid of all or any germs, dirt, or bacteria. And so what this suggests to us is that under conditions of high perceived responsibility, the goal of the behavior shifts from doable and generally verifiable, so returning hands to pre-contact state of cleanliness, to actually a fairly impossible and unverifiable goal, so ensuring that all germs, etc., are gone. I think that's really interesting. unverifiable goals leave a lot of room open for doubt to walk in the door and keep people stuck. And perhaps responsibility, perfectionism, etc., lend an urgency to the need to fully resolve that doubt, which would help us understand why this pattern keeps repeating itself. So moving on, we were also interested in the lab. Now I should say none of this has been systematic, like we did one study and then the next and then the next. These studies are all happening at once because if I waited to do one clinical study, I would have nothing to report for years. It just takes that long to collect clinical data. So concurrently with this, we ran another study where we did an in-depth interview with people about their internal experiences during their compulsion, and with a particular focus on doubting. And in this sample, there were 31 people with a diagnosis of OCD. And in terms of subtypes, we see contamination, doubt, and repugnant thoughts characterizing their compulsions. So we then asked them, in this episode, we asked them to conjure up in their mind a very recent episode of compulsive acts, so within the previous day or so. And what was interesting is we see that there's a lot happening mentally during that episode. So doubt, feelings, or impressions, sensory phenomena, I think that's very important. We need to start paying attention to what kind of sensory phenomena people are experiencing. And internal narrative and thoughts, and this is what I really want to point out to you. That and doubt, feelings, or impressions in particular, I think are really interesting for us to think about as clinicians. Images or pictures in the mind, you see that's highly endorsed. Word-based verbal thoughts are actually less endorsed. And in our sample, we had no felt urges. But what was interesting is that people reported that they experienced sort of a mean number, about 3 of those different aspects of mentation. But doubt was the most distressing form of those. Okay. So then we asked them more about this doubting voice or the internal narrative. And what we found was that for 44% of the people who endorsed having some kind of internal conversational thought, it was either an internal voice or an internal dialogue or conversation. And then what my student did, and she has to take credit for this was her idea, is she mapped the voice of that conversational thought on the interpersonal circumflex. And so she rated it on the friendly to hostile and dominant to submissive quadrants. And what she found is that typically the tone was neither friendly nor hostile for most people, it was neutral, and that it was typically dominant versus neutral versus submissive. And for some people there was an anxious tone as well. And what's interesting, well, okay, so I'll talk about what's really interesting about that in my mind in a moment. But let's then look at the appraisal of doubt. So she asked them, when you experience this doubt, what does it mean to you? And in OCD, we don't tend to talk a lot about core schema, right? We talk about beliefs and appraisal, but we don't really talk about where from the self those ideas might be coming from. But what she found is that when people experience the doubt, a lot of them appraised it in a way that suggests that there are some negative underlying core schema about the self as not being good enough, as being worthless, as being defective, as being a bad person, as being a disappointment to others. And so I think what can be really interesting about this is that conversational thought may be quite common in OCD, and it may be characterized by the introduction of a doubt. So they do something, and then there's a doubting voice that says, "Are you sure?" And that voice, if you think about a neutral dominant voice, is the quintessential authoritative voice. So, are you sure? What if? Maybe you. Did you? And I think that can lead to a scramble to determine if the proposition could in any way be valid. And of course, you can find a reason why anything could be valid, any reason to doubt, because you don't have anything verifiable to tell you that it's safe. So then if you find a reason to doubt, then you need to start to appease to resolve the doubt. And again, the voice is often neutral dominant, which is highly authoritative, difficult to ignore. And remember that in the interpersonal circumflex, dominance pulls for submission. We also need to factor in that doubt is often appraised as evidence of character flaws. And so what we might be seeing is that the compulsion is being performed to achieve a sense of self-worth, that there could be a very distal goal that's highly important, that's energizing or endowing that compulsion with enormous significance and importance. So now, moving on, so we did our diary study where we had people do a retrospective self-report. We wanted to improve on that. So this time, we just collected these data. I was on Monday night at the airport with these data in hand. Here we have 28 people with a diagnosis of OCD, 20 were washers, 8 were checkers. And they reported on their compulsions over 6 days using a tablet. Now, what we did is we had the person come in, they identified a compulsion that they do daily, and they stuck with that compulsion to record on every day for 6 days. So the same compulsion every day for 6 days. Then we sent them home with a tablet. And on the tablet was a semi-structured interview with a timing function. And they wouldn't be given any feedback about the timing. So their instruction was, when the compulsion starts, just press a button. But it gives them no feedback about the time. When the compulsion stops, they press a button. And they have no access to that data. We do, but they don't. And then they answer a series of questions. And in particular, what I'd like to focus on is we ask them about the goals of the compulsion in that episode. So we asked them, during the compulsive episode, how certain did you want to be that the compulsion was done properly, that you felt personally satisfied, that harm has been avoided, that you would not feel guilty if harm were still to occur, that you would not hold yourself responsible if harm were still to occur, that others would not hold you responsible if harm were still to occur. And they rated each one of those on a 0 to 100 scale. So here is a correlation of, so we aggregated their responses across the 6 episodes and divided by the number of episodes. Like some people, like you send people home with tablets, they go rogue. So some people did like 8 episodes and some people did 4. So this is the average aggregated divided by the number of episodes they reported on. But I just want to draw your attention to a couple of very interesting, to me. One is, look at the correlation between feeling personally satisfied and the goal of avoiding having others hold me responsible for the outcome. And look at the relationship between harm avoided and guilt avoided. I think that's quite interesting. Guilt avoided and avoid holding self-responsible. But this is the one I would like to focus on a little bit. The idea that the goal of becoming personally satisfied is redundant with the idea of others holding me responsible if harm were to still occur. So, keeping that in mind, I did a series of within subjects comparison to try to determine which goals were more important. And so we'll look at comparison 1, where we compared guilt avoidance versus harm avoidance. And so this ties into the idea that it's not the probability of harm that's the issue, it's being responsible for that harm. And what we find is that there's a significant difference, except that harm avoidance seemed more important than guilt avoidance. But don't despair, front row people. Because when we look at this goal, avoid being held responsible by others, which is this redundant with feeling satisfied, we see that that is a lot more important, significantly more important than harm avoidance. And what was finally quite interesting is that it was more important to avoid being held responsible by others than it was to avoid being responsible to the self. And that was actually quite a big difference. Okay. So, very interesting, and I will be putting all of this together in a moment. But then let's look at the stop criteria people looked at or reported. So this was their verbatim report. They just wrote in their own words why they stopped it. I categorized it according to these categories, put it in these categories. And you see that the most common stop criterion was to feel satisfied. And if we go back to our early statistic, what that seems to mean is that to feel that I can't be held responsible, other people won't be able to hold me responsible for harm. What we also see, what's kind of interesting, is that continuing would cause some consequences, such as being late, or abrading or burning the skin. So that will come into play in a moment, these two ideas. So from this study, what we might conclude is that ensuring satisfaction was a key goal during compulsions, and sense of satisfaction was a key termination criterion. Satisfaction was redundant with the goal of doing the compulsion properly and ensuring others would hold me responsible for harm. And so what this suggests is that compulsive acts may often be conducted under the imagined scrutiny of others. And if you think of this from a social anxiety perspective, like we always tell people, you can never know what other people are thinking and you can never please everybody. Well, you can never be sure if others think you have done enough. But ensuring personal satisfaction or having a valid excuse for stopping, such as you're going to be late for something else or your hands are going to burn, at least justifies stopping. And stopping, whereas stopping before you feel you've done it properly, or stopping without a valid excuse, is perhaps viewed as being wantonly careless in the eyes of these others, and then you'll be in trouble. So, those are the studies, that's the data, and I'd just like to talk about some general conclusions, and then what I think could be some interesting clinical implications. So, one is that the goals of the compulsions are actually quite varied, and we see escape avoidance goals, so avoiding harm, getting rid of germs or bad feelings or doubt. And that would be associated, completion of that goal would be associated with negative reinforcement. But I think we're also seeing some approach goals. So satisfaction, relief, certainty, perfection, purity. That's associated with positive reinforcement. I think we need to start factoring those ideas into our case formulation, recognizing that there's something quite positively satisfying at times for certain people's compulsions. And that might be very useful for us when we're trying to get them to engage in exposure to these interventions. We also see very proximal goals, such as clean hands, but we also see distal goals, such as keeping self from being held responsible for things. So I think we can gain a lot by asking people, what are you trying to accomplish? What are your immediate goals? What are your larger underlying goals? The second general conclusion I would say is that goal prioritization may be compromised during compulsions. So during compulsion, there's an exclusive focus on, seems to be an exclusive focus on harm avoidance and satisfaction until the external demands of the environment start to become more salient. So if you're in danger of being late for something important, or if you're feeling in physical pain. And so perhaps external demands are considered appropriate justification for terminating the compulsion prior to satisfaction. So you can answer to that jury in the sky and think, okay, they're not going to hold me responsible because I had to do this other thing. But I think it's interesting to keep in mind that anxiety narrows and threat narrow attentional scope. And a narrow attentional scope is associated with a focus on highly salient goals at the expense of other adaptive goals. A third conclusion I might say is that the obsessive-compulsive cycle may be characterized by the occurrence of conversational thought. And there's an internal dialogue with an OCD voice of authority, which is generating reasons to doubt the self. And the person is unwilling to view their own judgment as sound or as a justifiable basis for action. And this is consistent with the idea of seeking external proxies for internal states, that you don't feel you can trust yourself, so you're looking for external rules to follow. So in terms of the general conclusions, I would say that there could be some interesting potential clinical implications. So one thing that could be very easily introduced into treatment would just be a discussion of goal prioritization and helping people learn to broaden their attentional scope when they're conducting their compulsion, and be able to become aware of all of the goals that are important to them in this moment, and start to better prioritize. So help people keep a full range of proximal and distal goals in mind, and develop confidence in pursuing adaptive goals even if proximal compulsion goals have not been met. We also may want to work on helping people develop confidence, trust, and validation of their own judgment, so that they can feel comfortable moving, well, not comfortable, but they can feel that it's morally okay to move on from an act even if you haven't got that sense of certainty or don't have an excuse for causing harm. And help to develop the sense that your own judgment is good enough even if others can find reason to object. And finally, it may be useful to discuss the viability and utility of the goals of the compulsions and ask them, like, so for you, you're thinking that doing this hand wash perfectly is helping you feel like a worthy and valid person. But how well is that working for you, and are there other ways we can help you feel that way about yourself without needing to do an excessive amount of washing? The end.